First, hi guys, my name is Chris Williams. I am the VP of Programming for AMA Detroit. Help putting on a lot of these events for you guys here in the area. Um, if you guys have not attended our events, please check out our website. We try to do those a couple times a month, and as COVID protocols and things like that begin to get more relaxed, and as people begin to get more comfortable, we are planning on doing some more in-person events, especially when we kick off early 2022. But again, check out our website, amadetroit.org, and it's going to have all that information. If you are not a member, I highly encourage you to become a member and to do some research on us. I've been a member for 2 years, and as a professional, it's been really helpful for me to not only have a network of people that I can lean on, but there's some pretty cool tools that help me not only personally, but also professionally. So I, again, highly recommend it. But today we have a special webinar for you guys. Today we're going to be talking about accessibility in marketing. And to do that, we have Kristen Shaw. Kristen is currently the Communications and Public Involvement Coordinator for WSP. And she also is the co-author of the book, Women-Driven Mobility. And she has a history in public relations and marketing as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Kristen. Kristen, it's all yours.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay and see my screen?
I can hear you and see your screen.
Okay, perfect. So hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Shaw. Thank you for having me on here today and to talk about something that I get to do in my day-to-day accessible marketing and making sure that communications and different campaigns and assets have reach to absolutely as many people as possible. So I want to just start with a very brief kind of about me. My background is in public relations and marketing. After working in kind of the field for a little bit, I went on to work in hospitality, tourism, and events, which kind of led me down this path that eventually got me to transportation mobility. So I went back to school at Wayne State and studied urban planning, and I now do some climate consulting and do green buildings and sustainability consulting as well. So I have a little bit of a mixed background and get to wear a couple different hats. I also am a photographer and graphic designer on the side in my free time. And then I recently published a book with Caitlin Davis, who's local to the Detroit area. Some of you might know her, and it's titled Women-Driven Mobility. And we actually just started pre-sale for that. It should be in copy coming this December. So very excited about that. So wanted to start with kind of just what we're going to be talking about today. How do we define accessibility in kind of a broad sense, but also how are we defining it in our day-to-day and what is the application of that? Want to talk about why it matters, how to merge that with the brand, what usable accessibility is, how that's a little bit different, go over some tools, and then talking about business through it. And then I want to leave a little more time for Q&A so I can help answer some questions and maybe make this more of a little bit of a discussion on how you can apply these principles to your work. So starting with just a kind of a simple exercise here, I really like this as like a metaphor. It's an electric toothbrush. This slide to me is kind of ugly. Nothing really looks great about it. It's not good design. And I'm picking on this font a little bit because it's kind of hard to read. The story of the electric toothbrush is pretty cool because it is something that was initially developed for folks that had limited mobility, but I used one. I think they're pretty standard in a lot of households. To guess, you might use one even, or have used one in the past. But this whole kind of dental progress, I guess, came from a solution for as somebody who was physically might have had a disability or limited mobility. And so looking at this kind of, we have the toothbrushes, we have the font, the colors aren't stellar, but thinking about this slide and how you could make it more accessible, just very simply dialing the size down a little bit, changing the font, increasing some contrast, and then providing a little bit more of a description. And so between these two slides, just showing how you're getting the same message across. I know I was picking on the design of the first one a little bit, but how much of a story you're telling with words actually does matter. And I know that sometimes in design and in marketing, less is more, but as we kind of get into this movement isn't really the right word, but this progress that we're making in the industry, making sure that we are using ample descriptions is becoming, I think, the standard, and definitely is more inclusive for more people to be a part of the campaigns or the projects or the communications, whichever applies most to you in the work that you do. So this is kind of the standard accessibility definition. I have a visual on here about just different versions of color blindness. So kind of putting two and two together, I think when we think about accessibility, it often relates pretty specifically to disabilities. And we think about ADA compliance, and accessibility from a marketing standpoint is actually a lot bigger. And I'll kind of go into what those elements and how they work together are. But just thinking about when the end user experience of anything really. I work a lot with streetscapes, sidewalks, with roads and transportation related items. And so accessibility in my work is very physical and tangible from a marketing standpoint. And we're thinking about documents and designs and graphics and things of that sort. It's kind of making sure that people can still have access to them regardless of what barriers they might have. And accessibility really kind of here goes back to that disability angle, but then I kind of like to bring in usability. So we have to think about multiple things. And I know there's a lot of words here, so bear with me on this, but the application of whatever we're designing, whether it be a street or a PDF, making sure that the end user can actually have the same experience as somebody who doesn't have any type of ability barrier, or that maybe has a different experience or is using a different tool to access whatever that might be. And so we think about combining accessibility and usability, and then we're going to talk about inclusion next. It's kind of this broader version of accessibility that I'd like to invite you to consider when thinking about how to apply this to communications and marketing. So the third thing is inclusion. And so in order to actually have a product or an item that is able to be as accessible as possible, we really have to consider all three of these things. In tandem with this kind of accessibility progress that's being made in my industry and then in the work that I'm sure that you are doing, inclusion is also a pretty big conversation or part of the conversation. So I've noticed, so many companies looking at what inclusion means to them as a brand, what it means to their employees, how to incorporate and to really elevate diversity to be a key pillar of their either programming or of their corporate culture. But when we think about it here, it's that accessibility really touches much more than just disabilities. We have to think about the different types of experiences that people are having that might have their message received be a little bit different than how it was intended, or could actually completely block the message from getting to them. And so, like I mentioned, lots of words here, but this really simplifies it. If we are able to kind of look at how, accessibility is a piece of it, inclusion is a piece of it, and usability is another piece of it. And so considering all three of these things, and then also considering the different elements independently, it gets us to usable accessibility, which is making sure that absolutely as many people can receive the message, use the product, are going to be able to make that purchase and become a customer. It's creating more opportunities to engage with more people. From a business case, this is fantastic. I do a lot of work with municipalities and with the federal government. So for the work that I do, it's often required. And when we don't meet the metrics, or we don't reach as many folks as we need to, we often go back and, where's the gap? How can we expand on one of these areas or invest in one of these areas to really make sure that we are getting that reach out there? An example, this is related kind of that we really focus on specifically is environmental justice outreach. So understanding from an inclusion standpoint that broadband limitations and that different education levels, depending on the type of project that I get to work on. Those items might be new to the community, might have different implications from a geography standpoint. There might be income limitations to being able to participate equally. And so this really kind of myriad of three approaches to accessibility helps us make sure that a plan is comprehensive and that it's really actually reaching people in a meaningful way. And the usability piece of it, I think, really came into play with the pandemic and everything moving online. So depending on your product, your service, or the program that you're working on, working with youth and seniors on both ends of that spectrum has been something that I think COVID and the pandemic really elevated for us to do a double take on and make sure that if we're doing only virtual messaging, making sure that it's getting to those younger populations in the way that we want it to, and making sure that our senior populations are able to participate without challenges and also that they're comfortable. So there's a little bit of extra work that has gone in from the work that I do in my team to make sure that if we are working with seniors, that there is an extra level of outreach where that's maybe an education component for people to participate in a way that it wasn't there before. And this is kind of just a shortcut to what I was just saying, but making sure that usable accessibility exists and really is front and center for the work that you are doing, whether it be marketing or a project itself. And this all kind of comes back to UX, which I'm sure we've heard a lot about as we develop apps, websites, different interactive displays, whether it be at a conference or something that you can do in a retail store. Thinking about the end user is how we get the push for a lot of these programs to move forward, and we do the work that we do to kind of make the case for the end user will get this, and here's how we convert that into something from a business standpoint. When we rethink this and we think about our audiences and who we want to talk to and what the end user is going to experience, and then consider the usable accessibility into that, it really opens up the ability to reach more people, to make more sales, to make a bigger impact. And so it's kind of like UX plus. I think it's what UX always intended to kind of be and to serve as, but it takes it to that step further and has a little bit more intention into it. And so this is more on the disability side of the conversation. But when we're thinking about people with any type of disability, any limitations to ability, whether it be mobile or maybe cognitive, there's lots of different versions of this. And this is something that has been a big learning curve, I think, for me, is understanding really the breadth of what types of experiences people are having. And I think empathy is a huge piece of this, and understanding that there's no way we can actually fully understand what somebody is going through, but really trying to think about their experience and how they might be viewing or engaging in something is probably very different than myself. That, I'm very fortunate to not have any like low vision. I can see all the colors to my knowledge. And I think that that's great for me when I'm designing these things, but understanding that low contrast or a different color combination or something might prohibit somebody from having the same experience, I think is something that I try to be very cognizant of as I work on producing these materials. And so when we think about disabilities and then also inclusion and the usability aspects of it, I think there is definitely a responsibility from ourselves as communicators to do some of this education and to do some research on what this looks like, to better understand, to be able to empathize in process and start to understand the experiences that folks are having. I think one of the things that I didn't consider previously before the pandemic was closed captioning and transcripts and how different those are. And I'll go into it further in the presentation, but thinking about the fact that sometimes it makes sense for a video to operate without any audio. But if you don't set that up correctly, you are now removing a group of folks who might have been able to engage previously by simply only having it be visual to the eye. And so myself, I'm a very visual person. I like to operate without words when I can. Captions, I think the shorter the better. But thinking about my experience is not the, the only experience when working on these things. And I know that as marketers, we do a good job of kind of considering those things. But to this level and to be as comprehensive in this thought is something that was kind of brought to the surface for me at a much higher level once I started working on transportation projects over the past couple of years. And so in considerations of how we do this, to the right is kind of, your standard chart for what you would do when you're working on personas for projects. We do this a lot in transportation projects for like usage, who's using the facilities, who's using the roads. But I know from a product standpoint, this is something that exists when we're looking at developing our audiences for marketing, for advertising, and for just other versions of outreach. So in considering kind of how we're thinking about our end users and we're thinking about our customers, our clients, and people who will be engaging with our materials, it's how are we looking into the aspects of their life, their education level, their experiences, but also how are they physically engaging with the work that we're doing? How are they touching it, feeling it, using all of their different senses? And then what spectrum is there on those experiences for us to consider that we can make a better experience for them? And the big takeaway from all of these things is that if you start planning here and you start your designs here, then it should fit more people rather than starting the other way of, if you have a persona that you're really identifying with, maybe take it a step further and think about if maybe they have mobility limitations. How would they experience this differently than somebody who doesn't? And so if you are planning for the person who might have those mobility differences, then you're also planning for the person who doesn't have them. And so here is kind of a short list of things to consider. This by all means isn't the only thing and the only list, but thinking about things like blindness, low vision, general disabilities, and then it goes into some of those other limitations that maybe are cognitive, are learning disabilities. If there's ages in here, not necessarily as a disability, but as something that maybe you're not planning for in a totally comprehensive way. Same thing with geography, culture. I know that we do a good job of considering these things when we're thinking about audience development, but then again, taking it that one step further to think about if they have a different experience, how can you plan for that? How can you design for that? And then who else will have a better experience because of that planning? And so these are, I'm going to kind of go through some tools of what we can talk about in application. So I wanted to stay away from design solutions. I could go on forever about different things that you could do in Microsoft Word or Adobe products to make sure that your files are compliant. And wanted to kind of think about some of the other just ongoing checklists that we can give ourselves on our day-to-day work to make sure that what we're doing is kind of the groundwork for accessibility and for that usable accessibility, and therefore would, only deliver compliant or accessible documents kind of moving forward. The difference between open closed captions and then also subtitles, something that was newer for me to learn at a very granular level during the pandemic is that subtitles are much better for language, but often leave out those nonverbal cues that can be really important to communications. And so in the work I do, I host a lot of online webinars, a lot of meetings very similar to this. And we've worked with a lot of deaf communities, and Zoom is actually the tool that has come out on top as kind of being the preference from the community that is using American Sign Language. And I didn't have the training to conduct a Zoom meeting in American Sign Language prior to a year ago. But even thinking about that is when you're hosting a meeting, a listening session, a workshop, you're so excited about this event, it's moved online. Closed captions and subtitles can be very helpful, but also that next step of having somebody on there to do that interpretation, I think really makes a difference for people who might otherwise feel excluded from participating in those types of opportunities. Zoom, again, I kind of Zoom fangirl a little bit that we really lean on Zoom heavily, and it's kind of like a joke. You know, we all have you're on mute. I've seen it on coffee cups and things like that. But it's really become a staple, and it's asking the other platforms such as Teams and GoToWebinar and WebEx to kind of step up and make these items available for everybody. The closed captions and the transcripts, I believe, initially were a paid feature, and Zoom has since done an upgrade where you can turn them on during the meeting, and then it provides a transcript, which can really help with any cost limitations that you might experience when you're working on an end product and you want to provide that extra level of accessibility through the captioning. And so kind of thinking about that and the transcripts, and then also the subtitles, initially at the beginning of the pandemic, this is something that was never built into the projects that we had. And so from a budget standpoint, it provided a little bit of limitation to understand that we now have these costs. We now have to spend time doing transcription services. And I think it was a large lesson for me personally to understand that we didn't now have to do it. We were just being reminded that the work that we were doing might have not always been for everybody. And I think that there was a big takeaway there that if you just plan to have these other elements of accessibility kind of baked into the work you do, more people can participate. While I've rambled on a bit about the captioning, the other thing that's on this slide is accessibility in documents. There's a couple just kind of like best practices, very technical aspects of how you can check these. Adobe Acrobat Pro is a fantastic tool. Both the Microsoft suite and the Adobe suite are really great with having tutorials on how to teach yourself these things, and then also how to just quickly check them for accessibility. As I mentioned earlier, I work on a lot of federal programs and work with a lot of government entities. And so the accessibility for us isn't something that we can do, it's something we have to do. And so working with the American Disabilities Act, and then also with Title VI and understanding all of this like legislation around protecting our community members and making sure that they can, you know, access things in the same ways that you know, maybe I can or you can, is something that I had to familiarize myself with a lot. And what it comes down to eventually is that if you don't do a good job at this, or you are excluding people, or you aren't making a good faith effort, funding can get pulled. And so from the private sector, I think it's it's a little bit different when you're working on sales and things like that. But when you're working on public programs and community investments, it's absolutely critical that those voices are all at the table, as many as possible. And those voices don't have to be verbal, right? They don't have to be audio. It can be a comment, it can be an email, it can be through a reader. And so making sure that you have room for all of that is, I'm going to call it a big lift, just and that the work that I was doing previously before the pandemic didn't always include those. And so I think sometimes it feels like some extra steps, but hopefully with conversations like this today and with the work that you are all going to do after, it will just eventually become the norm. So here is a couple of just key points. I touched on some of these with the webinars and the online meetings. Language is another piece of this that I mentioned earlier and haven't talked too much about. I am Detroit based. I live in Detroit, and a lot of my projects are in Detroit. And we work often with Spanish and with Arabic. And with having those resources available, knowing who you can go to for translation, understanding different dialects, and having people engaged and in the community, just to make it as easy as possible for people who maybe prefer another language, don't know how to request more information, or maybe don't want to engage in English if that's the language you're providing things in. Giving them the option to engage in a way that's comfortable to them is very important to how the work that we do, I think, reaches out to communities and making sure that it's an easy process, and then also that it is one that they're comfortable doing. ASL interpretation, kind of another version of that, as having, translators kind of on the ready and knowing who you can go to for that. Also having somebody who knows American Sign Language. I think if you've ever considered learning ASL, I would say do it. It's something that I think is incredibly valuable, especially now that we are still online in a very significant way and probably will continue to be. I think, I studied Spanish, and that was great. And I didn't consider ASL, and looking back, it's something that I think I would really enjoy learning. And so over the past year and a half, I've really considered, like, what would that look like for me to learn that? And then when would I be able to apply that? Closed captioning, again, Zoom is a great tool for that. But there are lots of different closed captioning services that you can either pay for, or like even YouTube has something that's pretty accessible that you can just upload a video or recording, and you can get a pretty good quality transcript through there. Offering the meeting materials before and after allows people to either reference them and spend some more time on them, prepare their questions if they may need a little more time than what's offered through the limitations and like the 1 hour meeting like we have today. On-demand streaming also allows that. So if you have a presentation, posting it later so that if they have a tool that they prefer to use, that they're able to then rewatch the presentation or maybe watch it for the first time in their own comfortable way. So if there's translation or closed captioning, or if they want to just do it at a different speed, it allows them to do that. Also, social media streaming is really good for inclusion. So not everybody has access to data on a cell phone or internet in their home, but you can usually get somewhere where you can access public internet. A lot of people use Facebook instead of having a phone number. They're using Facebook instead of having an email address. It's how they're communicating with their family and their communities. And I know that there's a lot of back and forth on, which social media channel are we going to invest in? Where are we going to spend the most time? And it's very much not like the spray and pray, like just throw it out there, but it's being intentional about understanding your market and what platforms they're using. From a transportation and from a public planning perspective, that often is Facebook and Twitter, which we often kind of joke about from I really like Twitter, but a lot of people think it's kind of over. And so, understanding if you have a population who's using that regularly, like still engage on it, and then also include the links for people to join, or if you're able to stream through there, to go ahead and do that. And then also the participation options. And so in a lot of the experiences that I've had with doing these virtual meetings, we're offering polling, surveys, Q&A, but sometimes there's hesitation to let people speak or to let them share their screen, but making sure that you're not limiting it to just one way of communication, because it might not work for everybody. And so kind of thinking about everything that's on the screen and online meetings and the webinars, I think a lot of these items can apply to any videos you might be producing for social media campaigns, for marketing efforts, for like in-person activations that are more visual, and kind of thinking about how you can bake some of these elements in a way that will make the audience more comprehensive, and not just maybe an age group. Maybe it's just a little bit more specific than what you were originally thinking. So this is something, when I was asked to do this presentation, that I was trying to figure out how can I show a good example of good branding, strong branding, and accessibility. And I included this list of questions on here that's kind of just a good checklist. And if you're able to achieve these with your brand, I think that you should be in a good position to have accessible content. Something that we struggle with on a lot of the projects that I work on is color contrast. So because you need to have a very high contrast color scheme in order to achieve accessibility, it limits the creativity. And so there's this balance of being able to be creative and very on brand, and then also being accessible and developing something that lots of people can have access to. There's lots of resources. I have a kind of like a cheat sheet that I'll share with the organizers to distribute to all of the attendees, so that you can kind of take a look at like what these questions are and where you can check on these items when you're developing like graphic assets. But I think when we're looking at brand guidelines, we look at like what looks good, what feels good, what resonates with our audiences. And that's all good and well. But if you are maybe a glasses company, right? And I wear glasses, I should have them on right now. And maybe your colors are like a pale yellow and a white, that won't work for these guidelines. And so how can we avoid people kind of squinting, just me who should have my glasses on, squinting at something and then thinking about what that experience might be for somebody else who maybe really depends on that high contrast. And so it's this kind of checklist of what is the call to action? Is it in a verbal sense, and then is it also visually there with like an image or a graphic? I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a tendency to really depend on visuals and images. And if we're going to do that, we really have to make sure that the text that goes with it, the alt text, which I'm sure some of you have encountered, is very detailed. And so that if you were looking at the screen with your eyes closed, you would understand exactly what was on the screen. And so making sure that that call to action is very clear from an ask standpoint, but also very clear from an access standpoint, that you understand it when you hear it, you understand it when you read it, and it isn't dependent on one or the other. The fonts, I think, is probably one of the most important thing. I'm sure everybody on this call has seen an example of a font that either a font pairing or a font selection that really could have been better. And then thinking about what that looks like when you put those words into, a reader. If the human eye can't decipher a word through fonts, or if the kerning is maybe a little too tight, the reader is not going to be able to pick it up either. And so when we're looking at fonts, that we are doing something very clear, very standard, and something that makes it easy to read. I went back and forth on this presentation on how much time and effort I was going to put into the design of it. But I think just like really the font, something very basic, bold, black and white, the font size is large enough. Like I said, I do design, and I didn't want to get into this and make sure the whole presentation was ADA compliant and also like stunningly, graphically beautiful, because I think the message is really what needs to carry in this specific context of what we're talking about today. But thinking about that, like I hope that you can all view the screen and read it in a very clear way. And then the kind of the next step from that is the font size and the channels. And so thinking about what that message looks and sounds like when it's coming from a computer, when it's coming from a TV, when it's coming from a billboard or a cell phone. I know that as marketers, we do a good job of understanding, are people reading this on mobile? Are they using a web platform? Are they on an iPad? We kind of already do that, but then taking it to that next level and understanding that the channel is really important, and then also the device and the channel combined is really important. And so if it's difficult in your smallest format, it's not going to be any easier for somebody, in a little bit bigger format, on, comparing maybe like a phone and an iPad. And then that next level is the assistive technology. And so if you have a campaign and it's on a bunch of different platforms and different channels, and maybe it's multimedia, is that message consistent enough to be strong for the brand? But then is it consistent enough from accessibility, so that the end user is able to understand that what they're seeing is a piece of a story, is a piece of a campaign. It's something that goes with other items. I don't have experience using assistive technology, but there's different testing solutions. There's different platforms that you can kind of run things through to make sure that somebody who is using that technology would be able to really take in the entire message of whatever you're sharing with them. And then the thing it's kind of sandwiched in the middle, the landing page. And so I think, I don't know if this is still the rule, it's what I was taught is, 2 clicks in and people are done on your website unless there's something very specific they want. And so when you're building a website or you're, maybe rebranding or restructuring, the landing page is one of your most important parts, and making sure that accessibility is front and center, and that if folks do need any type of different accommodation or need to experience that page in a different way, whether that be a different language or that should be, maybe they need to read it and have the alt text be on, that they know exactly where to go, and they don't have to, work hard to kind of click through and to find out how they can experience that. And then this is kind of the business case for it. When I was thinking about this presentation, majority of, I think actually almost all of the work I do doesn't touch, there isn't like a transaction from a conversion standpoint, like there might be if I was selling something, let's call it, we'll go back to glasses. If I'm selling glasses and that's my product, understanding how to make a business case for that isn't something that I've worked on at any level. What I work on are large infrastructure projects that are kind of hard to, in my head, convert to a sales version. But just thinking about reach and, a customer base, understanding that when we leave people out of conversations, it's not a full story, and that it's exclusionary. And so when you start with kind of considering everybody's experience, you'll be able to catch the people that maybe you were planning for initially. But in making the case for this from a business perspective, a lot of these resources might include additional budget requirements, additional labor requirements, additional skill sets, trainings, certifications. There's a business case in it that, depending on what you are working on, what you're selling or what you're promoting, that we all want to kind of make sure we're hitting the right audiences and making sure that we're hitting enough of the right audience. And we all like to exceed our goals, right? So there's kind of this untapped potential here where there's disposable income. It says 490 billion that could be spent. I mean, all of it not, but could be spent in your various areas, in your products, in your companies, in your stores, that, the marketing might just actually get to them in a way that it doesn't from another maybe competitor, or from a similar product, or from a service that they weren't considering. I think, like, this is so silly, but I am a huge dog person. I thought about putting my picture of my dog in here, and I joke about targeted ads sometimes, right? Like you think something and it's on your phone. And somebody sent me a dog button command thing where you can verbally put cues in and touch them. And I thought, how the heck did this not ever get to me with all of like the dog training I do? And it was like that feeling that somebody saw it and sent it to me. And I was like, wow, I wish I would have seen this before. I totally would have spent money on this, as ridiculous as it might be. But that kind of feeling that hit me the other day, and understanding that there's a chance that, depending on your product or the service that you offer, that there's somebody out there who might not even know that they want it yet, because they don't know that it's there. And so by increasing the accessibility and the really like actual reach potential from the marketing that you're doing, the communications that you're doing, you're going to be able to kind of make those touch points, and eventually, whether it's a conversion or just a happy customer or a happy resident or a happy stakeholder, it's kind of creating a relationship where there might have not been one already. And then I think that's it. So tons of information there. There are so many technical resources. I will provide that cheat sheet for everybody here on this call, so that you're able to kind of click through if you're interested in any certifications, or if you just want a resource that says, how am I compliant in a PDF from an ADA standpoint? Lots of resources for that. Here's my contact information. My portfolio website is currently down, so I put my photography website on here. And then if you're interested in women-driven mobility, a lot of that book is actually kind of about this topic of, designing for a few really serves many. And then I put my Twitter handle on here. I sometimes tweet articles about the stuff like this. Mostly it's about the book and the dog, but please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or you're looking to take your marketing, to a place where more people can access it. And with that, I think we're going to go into Q&A.
Thank you, Kristen. That was a great presentation. I think this is a really good topic too on how to, include more people. And I think it's something a lot of people don't think about. So definitely be checking out those resources. We do have a couple questions here. The first is, where is your O&M degree from?
Oh, so that is an accreditation from USGBC, the United States Green Building Council, and it is LEED, so it's for green buildings. O&M is operations and maintenance, and so that's a sustainable green building operations sustainability accreditation that I have.
Oh, okay, very cool.
Yep,
very cool.
But I went to Wayne State, so Wayne State University for both of my degrees. So I am a proud warrior.
Very nice. All righty, and then we had one more. I think it was, says, do you have any resources or trainings you'd recommend for graphic designers?
Yeah, so I will send over that that PDF that has kind of the cheat sheet. These are a few of the links that I have on here. I put these on here and then I kind of started to walk it back because I think it really depends on the service and the product that you're working on. So a lot of these are for web content and for design. But I think if you look at like Adobe has a training, you can also, I think it's WC3, which is the web content accessibility page. There are lots of trainings and I'll send that list out. But I think when I started doing this work and needed to kind of check these boxes for work and for projects, what was the most helpful for me was just kind of teaching myself how to do it. So going into Microsoft Word, clicking on the accessibility items that are in there, same thing with Adobe. You can do all of those checks just within those programs. And there's like different platforms online that you can upload things through. From a training standpoint, if there is a certification, I think there is one. I don't have one because I don't do graphic design as 100% of my role. But we have, I think on our team, 3 or 4 folks that are kind of our last stop on any items that we send out before we hand them over to clients. And then within a lot of our clients, they'll have somebody kind of in their department that will go through and do their own version of an accessibility check. And depending on the audience, sometimes there is a variance between what they want and what you deliver. So I think that the trainings are good and they definitely will give you a lot of best practices, but it definitely varies on who you're talking to and what type of accessibility need you are working towards.
Makes perfect sense. We had another question come in. It says there's a lot involved in accessibility. Where do you recommend starting?
I think thinking about this, I think the audience is probably the best place. So when we're doing those persona considerations, who we're trying to reach, and understanding if there's a disability or like an access consideration there that might not allow that or permit them to have like a very easy way into be a part of the campaign or be a part of the program. I think kind of starting there. And so I think one of my biggest examples that I like to use is kind of where accessibility starts for me is strollers. So I work in transportation, and I recently spent some time doing some research on gender inequities in the transportation industry. That's kind of what the book's about. And strollers, I think, are one of my favorite examples of how we don't think about accessibility in a comprehensive way. We're very good at planning for bikes, and we're very good at planning for cars, and we're very good at planning for, we're okay at planning for wheelchairs, but we don't really plan for strollers. And so when you think about the experience that somebody has who is bringing a bike onto a bus or is using a wheelchair onto a bus, somebody with a stroller is having a different experience than either either one of those options. And there also isn't really infrastructure built for them to get a stroller on easily. And I don't have kids. I was a nanny for a little bit, so I can't even really speak to this from a personal experience. But if you've ever watched somebody try and put a stroller up a staircase, you understand where I'm going. And so by designing a place for a stroller, maybe you're also designing for the bike and you're also designing for the wheelchair. And I don't think it's a perfect metaphor because all three of those needs are very different, but in a transportation standpoint, and in the work that I've recently done with gender and the different needs that like a mom would have or could have differently than maybe somebody who's childless or doesn't have a kid with them while they're in transit to somewhere, they're going to have a very different experience, and it's going to slow them down. It might be a complete barrier for them experiencing something. And so it's hard when you see it in person and you see somebody trying to get off of a sidewalk ledge and they just can't, right? It's just now is dangerous for them. Transportation and the application of that is very different than I think a marketing campaign, but I think I hope it paints enough of a picture that you're without that consideration, without that ramp, without that extra 5 seconds on a street light, that is now not an option for that person to now cross the street or to join this. I recently saw this at an event by the Detroit Institute of Arts, where they had a huge projection for a video, and it was so cool. And this woman just really couldn't get off the sidewalk to go around it. And, we had to have like 3 people kind of help her out. And it should never be that hard for somebody to get off of a sidewalk, just as it should never be that hard for somebody to access your website or to be a part of your campaign. And I think like when we think about like the stroller really sticks in my head, and I try to have that stroller mentality that there's probably a solution. We're just not considering it because we're planning for the things that we think we know. I can tell you that had I not been a nanny, I don't know that I would have considered the stroller thing without having kids. And so it's kind of like having these conversations. It's why I think the inclusion and diversity piece in the decision-making conversations is so important. But again, when you're applying that and looking for kind of like the business case for it, it's just that you're getting as many people as possible to participate in a way that they either want to or don't know that they want to yet, which creates a better business on your end.
Totally understand that. I have a 1-year-old, and we've done a little bit of traveling, and I'm thankful that one of the strollers we bought was one that like folds up to the size of a purse. It's really, really cool. So, but even then, like it's crazy, if you have anything in the stroller, or sometimes just getting the kid out, folding it up just to go up 6 or 7 stairs, a little tedious.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, usually my wife and I are together, so we can pick it up, and it's not a big deal. But I actually remember bringing that up this past summer. I was in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. I forgot where we were around the city, but we just picked it up and went. I'm like, man, that's unique. To me, Gatlinburg is an area that people travel to a lot. You would think that they would have or be a little bit more accessible. What if it was someone who couldn't just, let me just stand up and do this really quick? So I totally understand that, and the stroller stuff can be real sometimes, but it often and recently has made me think about, man, how serious are certain people taking the accessibility in certain places, and it makes you think what they're doing on their websites too. A lot of people may think that that's a place where you don't need to be, but you definitely need to be.
Yeah, and there's dollars lost there too, right? So if there's 2
Yes.
restaurants, and let's say maybe your wife stepped away for a minute, she's on the phone,
Mhm.
you have the stroller, right? And there's 2
Mhm.
restaurants, and one has 6 stairs and one doesn't. I mean, I'm not saying which one you're going to go into, but the one is much easier for you to get into
Right.
with you in the stroller, right? And there's dollars attached to that decision making, and that applies across the board, whether it's going where you're going to have dinner, or what type of couch you're going to buy, or like we look at cars. If anybody is going to become on my Twitter friend list, the thing that we saw yesterday was Peloton put out a commute solution for how you could ride your Peloton to work in like a little enclosed box. I have a Peloton. I love it. I am here for all of the good Peloton shaming that happens and that comes with having a Peloton. It was my COVID splurge because I had leg surgery, so I'll accept all of the heat that comes with that. But I looked at this graph, this rendering, and I thought, this is for men. I was like, where's the car seat? if I'm going to, and like, is there a shower when you get to work? You have to have a member, like, it's just this whole, like, you can self-power your car with your Peloton. And I was like, this is so wildly exclusive. It doesn't actually even make sense as a solution. It's kind of like, I think it's as, you know, effective as a pedal pub might be as a transportation solution. And so, but I was looking at it and I was like, I don't think anybody would put a car seat in this Peloton car shuttle thing, but like they could have. They had I could go on about car seats and childcare and strollers forever, but I think that the stroller metaphor for me is something that really stands out because, like, as somebody who doesn't have children, it still makes tons of sense. If there's a place that's built for a stroller or a wheelchair, it's easier for me to get in there with my bike. And it's kind of selfish, but also, you know, that empathy aspect, I think you can kind of mix it in there.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, we have one more question is, it's how would you recommend involving those who are trying to serve in creating the materials? Should we partner with organizations? For example, if we wanted to build materials and share them before launch for feedback.
Sure. So I think I'm wondering if this is asking that if there's anybody who has any type of accessibility concerns in the development of those materials. I think that's what it's asking. Is definitely the more diverse perspectives you can have in building it, the better product you're going to have. Something that I think is, you can hire people, right? Just, you can have an inclusive hiring process.
Right.
Or you can have advisory committees. There's other solutions besides those two, but advisory committees and the work that I get to do are really important. And so we do some targeted outreach with the ADA community, with seniors, and we test things on them, similar like you would do in like a focus group. What do you think about this? What's missing? And before we launch it publicly, we have that kind of loop of feedback happening, where if it's coming from somebody who has maybe who has a disability, but they still have somehow totally, you know, not considered that we created a very accessible website. But if we're looking at a zip code that has 30% internet access, that website doesn't matter now. So it's kind of the whole thing of definitely include people, but it's always good to kind of get that, like, that external feedback to say, does this fit? And I think, like, from an equity standpoint, if you can pay people to be a part of those advisory committees, it makes for a better end result. I'm fortunate that I am employed, and so any volunteer opportunity that I have that is seemingly professional, even such as this, I am compensated for. If I was unemployed or low income, or in a situation that maybe I was in 10 years ago when I was in college, right? Something doing like this is now a different value of my time. And so if you're using those advisory committees, or you're using those subject matter experts, making sure that they're compensated for their expertise is really important. And is honestly, like, the ROI is there. It's kind of hard to make a tangible case for it, but it's there because they're going to be the expert on their community. They're going to be the expert on what they have to offer and what they can kind of bring to the table. Sorry, I'm getting knocked down. This is what I get for being in the office. But I think being incredibly inclusive in your hiring is critical to making sure that when you're creating those materials that you have diverse perspectives. Partnering with organizations is great. I think if you can do that in a way where it's a partnership, and like for nonprofits and whatnot, there's value in sharing those resources. And then if you have the capacity to do any type of like focus group, advisory group, committee, council, something like that, that's another good way to kind of approach that. I think that's what the question was asking.
I think so too. I think you hit it pretty well. Yeah, okay. I think that was good. All righty. We are just right before the 1 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up. Kristen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insight. I will share these resources that you shared in your presentation with all those who registered. And yeah, feel free to reach out to Kristen for this topic, and to get more insight, follow her on Twitter. And yeah, we'll go ahead and close it out. Again, Kristen, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And also thank you to everyone who's like taken the time to learn about this. It's really important. I think the more people that we have that are comfortable having this conversation, just like the better the world will be. So it's my little save the world rah rah. So thank you guys for being here, for doing the work, and for having me.
No problem. Take care.
All right, take care.